All right, so module 30, impacts of urbanization and methods to reduce urban runoff. So our two learning targets today are explain urbanization and the effects on the environment and describe the methods to reduce urban runoff. All right. So, an increasing human population not only use more resources but take up more land space. The process of an area becoming more urban or increasing in the density of people per unit of area of land is called urbanization. So, people moving from rural America to a big city, that's urbanization, and things transforming from a small town to a big town, that's urbanization. Okay, I would say in my lifetime, Columbia has been urbanized. It definitely was not what it is now when I was even y'all's age. Okay. Urban populations represent 55% of the human population, but they're responsible for consuming 75% of the Earth's resources. An area that contains more than 386 people per square kilometer or 1,000 people per square mile are considered urban areas. So, for example, New York, they have 10,000 people per square mile of New York. Mumbai, which is in India, is 27,000 people per square mile, and then Jeff City is just barely makes that. They're 1,136 people per square mile for urbanization issues. Okay, so going to this next thing, you can see that developed nations and developing nations have differences in their urban population. So 48% of the developing world is in an urban population, whereas in a developed nation, 75% of the people live in an urban population. Okay, 17 of the 20 largest cities are in developing nations, so that means like countries that are still developing have actually more of the larger cities like Mumbai, probably areas that are packed with population without much infrastructure. Okay, so in my head, that comes to like India or a lot of the Middle East that's not fully developed yet. Okay, and then only 3 of the 20 largest cities happen in developed nations, such as like the UK, America, Germany, that kind of stuff, right? Okay, issues with this for some urban areas lack safe drinking water and sewage. So these people are all living on top of each other, and they don't have the basic infrastructure that like you and I are used to with running water that comes to our house when we turn on the faucet, or a toilet that flushes and takes away our sewage, or a trash service that picks up our waste every week. It takes it somewhere else. We don't have to deal with it, right? So these people are even more packed in than we are, probably, and they have those issues, and so it leads to other things like sanitation problems, health issues, those sorts of things, diseases. Okay, and then in developed nations, urban and rural areas have clean drinking water sewage systems. That's probably what most of you are definitely used to, including myself. Okay. So you have 2 graphics on this page. So the first graphic is percentage of people living in urban areas. And so it just shows you that the predicted amount is going to go up in the next 7 years from 2020. Okay, so more people are going to start living in bigger cities, which makes sense, right? Okay. And those are the top 20 cities, largest cities in the world. And you notice how America doesn't even crack the top 10. Number 11. Pretty great. Okay. So 100 years ago, populations moved from rural areas to urban areas. So give me some reasons why somebody would want to move from a rural area to an urban area. Jobs. What else?
Better access to resources.
Okay, better access to resources like what?
Health.
Healthcare.
Education.
Diversity of foods.
Oh yeah, okay, diversity of foods. I'm tired of eating potatoes because I live on this farm, right? Anything else?
Clean water.
Clean water, okay? So if you live out in the sticks or you live off the grid, which is kind of interesting because a segment of our population is going the opposite direction, right?
Community support.
What?
Community support.
Community support, yeah. So you want to feel part of the community. Good. So a lot of those things are reasons why people move into urban areas, okay? And I think probably mainly jobs, education, and healthcare are probably the top 3. Recently, urban areas have become denser in population, leading to an increase in numbers of suburbs. So a suburb are areas that surround metropolitan areas with lower population densities than urban areas and cities. So when I think of that, I think of like you have downtown St. Louis, like proper St. Louis, right? And then you have St. Peter's, and you have what else? St. Charles, yeah, right. So those would be the burbs, suburbs. Okay, in Kansas City, you have Kansas City proper, and then you have Lee Summit, you have Independence, you have all those areas, North KC, right? Okay, so those would be suburbs, things that are not quite as developed. I would say Jeff City in this area would be considered the city, but then areas around like Eldon, Brazito, Holt Summit, New Bloomfield, those would be like the example of our suburbs, even though they're not that big.
Yeah, it's straight rural, bro.
Yeah, they're more rural, but on a scale that you're used to, right? Yeah. Okay. And the exurbs have developed, which are like suburbs, but not connected to central city or densely populated areas. Okay. An estimated 2/3 of people live in suburban and exurban communities. Okay. So the movement of urbanized areas into rural areas is known as urban sprawl. With clusters of housing, retail shops, office parks, and miles of roads separating them. So whenever I think of this, I think of like the St. Charles like outlet malls. They're just kind of like randomly scattered on your way to St. Louis from Columbia, right? You just have kind of random on the side of the road, and you don't see anything for another 25 miles, right? So that is like instead of it going into a bigger city like St. Louis and repurposing some of those buildings, they just build new somewhere else. Okay, the main cause of urban sprawl is main causes of urban sprawl is increased availability of automobiles and highways. Okay, so especially in this part of the world, it is a common thing, right? When you turn 16, what do? You get your driver's license, you start driving. That's your access to freedom, right? But when you live in places like New York City or LA, 16 is not that big a deal because you're used to using public transportation and that kind of stuff, right? Okay, and so now that we have better access to everyone, automobiles relatively, you can buy a cheaper one to get around, right? And sometimes you have to have it here, right? Reasonable cost of living is another one in the suburbs. So typically places like Jeff City are going to be a lot cheaper to live in than places like St. Louis, inner city St. Louis. Lack of support for urban communities or urban blight. So we'll go into what that means in just a minute. Okay, and the government policies funding highways and subsidizing mortgages in suburban areas. So my first home loan was a USDA first-time home buyer's home loan, and what that does is they pay for or they cover the down payment of a select house in an area. So usually they're more rural areas because they're trying to get people to move back out to the rural areas and help those economies out. So they give you a discount on your interest and things like that. And so that's what that means is like the government's providing assistance to help you buy a house because they want you to live there for whatever reason. They're giving you incentive to move there. Okay. An increase in the movement to suburban areas brings issues such as increased congestions and longer commutes. So if you've ever lived in a big city, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Even Columbia is getting kind of not as bad, but it takes me 15 minutes to drive across Columbia because it is just full of stoplights and people driving, and then don't get me started when students are in town. You can tell a big difference in the summertime when students aren't here, how fast you can get across Columbia versus like right now, it takes so long, there's so many cars, right? So urban blight is on the left side, and so that's kind of the cycle. So what happens is suburban communities pop up, people move out that way because it's a little bit cheaper. So then they're moving out. When they leave, what happens to their tax dollars? Does it stay in the city they were living in, or does it go with them to the new place? Goes to the new place, right? So there's no longer, that city's not receiving that tax money. So then they're going to start having to cut budgets, right? So services cut. So now, okay, this bus doesn't come through anymore. I don't have any access to public transportation. Okay, so that means fewer customers for businesses. So businesses go out of business because there's not enough people living there, right? Because suburban areas are cheaper right now. And then that leads to fewer customers, fewer businesses, leads in nobody's taking care of your neighborhood. and then you start living in the slums, right? Okay, if you've ever been downtown St. Louis, Kings Highway, on one side of the highway it looks super nice, on the other side of the highway it's run down, right? Okay, back in the day it was all nice, but then people couldn't afford to keep living there and they moved out to the suburbs, and you see this cycle happen. So we're losing our tax dollars, we're losing our services, so that's even more reason for people to leave, right? This is what's happening in Columbia right now too, right? So we just lost our recycling service because there's not enough money in the system to pay for people to pick up your recycling, and we're starting to lose our free bus services and things like that. So people are going to start moving away from Columbia. It's going to happen. Okay, and then what happens now when you get suburbs that are expanding, right, is you have more congested traffic because more people are living there. And so, like Coach Collins and I drive from Columbia to Jeff City every day, right? And we can tell you that there's probably 50 other cars that leave at the exact same time we do to get to Jeff City because we want to live in Columbia. We want to live somewhere different where we work. So that adds to the congestion. We're also using more gas, which is causing, its own environmental problems with carbon dioxide. So thank God that we carpool, right? But then instead of money going towards things that we support, maybe it has to go towards highway construction because we need the highways to drive on for us to get to work, even though we'd rather go towards like a paycheck, something like that, right? Okay, and so that's what happens when your suburbs expand. Questions about that? See how all that stuff's kind of like interconnected and you don't even think about it? Yeah, I need. Okay, so one approach to reduce suburban sprawl or urban sprawl is to practice smart growth where communities are focused on strategies to develop sustainable and healthy communities. Okay, distinct communities strive to create a sense of place, the feeling that an area has meaningful character. So a sense of place, as defined in your book, is just somewhere where somebody feels like they belong. So things that will help that is community groups, right? I'm just going to keep referencing Columbia because that's where I live, but we have a senior center. So that's a place where older people who may not have family in town can go and hang out with other older people, right? If you have the farmer's market, or if you have after school programs or things like that, you're going to feel more connected to your community, little leagues, that sort of thing, right? The Environmental Protection Agency or EPAs list the following when considered smart growth. So the more walkable your neighborhood is, the more likely you're going to stay because you don't have to necessarily use a car to get places. That's why people like living in bigger cities because they can tend to walk everywhere. Okay. It's also, you're not having to use as much car, so it's more environmentally friendly if I can just take a 5-minute walk instead of having to drive across town to get to this business. So that means you have to mix your residential, your retail, and recreational businesses for land use. So it makes sense to have like all of those things within a couple mile block of where you're living because then you're not going to have to travel as far, right? Things are more condensed. Encourage stakeholder collaboration. So this means that like they're encouraging you to vote on things that are happening in your community or go to town hall meetings or city council meetings and that kind of stuff. Go to your school board meetings, that kind of thing, okay? Because when you feel a part of something, you're less likely to tear it down, right? We have a working agreement in this class that we helped come up with. And for the most part, everybody's been living by it, right? Okay, good. And then preserving your open spaces and natural beauty. So where my parents live, they live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and part of their tax money goes to maintaining and preserving open spaces. And it's supposed to be that no matter where you are in that town, you're only a 5-minute walk from an open space because they believe that's a big part of mental health. And so the part of their taxes go to maintaining the paths and things like that of where they are. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so greater populations in urban and suburban areas lead to more use of aquifers and surface waters for agriculture and municipal use. Okay, so the bigger population is, the more water you need. Reduced groundwater levels near shorelines have led to an intrusion of saltwater in an area where freshwater was previously found due to the cone depression forming and a saltwater intrusion. We'll look at a picture of that in just a minute. Okay, the other problem is impervious surfaces. Pavement or other surfaces that do not allow for water penetration could lead to reduced infiltration of precipitation and more flooding due to runoff. Okay, so this first one is talking about saltwater intrusion. So when the water level is high enough, it's going to keep the saltwater at bay. I'm assuming because the saltwater is probably more dense, so it's going to try to stay under the fresh water, right? And then what happens is you're using more water as a city, so you get a kind of depression, and so the saltwater volume hasn't changed, the freshwater has, and so it has less pressure keeping it below, so it's going to start popping up into those people's water systems. So you're going to get more salt water, which we know is not good for you. So using too much water at one time or one spot is caused, and this is called a saltwater intrusion. So salt water is getting into your wells if you use too much water from your aquifer. All right, now we're finally on our second one. So it says urban runoff occurs when soil from urban areas don't evapotranspirate or infiltrate the soil. Okay, and there's a few reasons why they do that. So reducing impervious surfaces would mitigate this issue, as well as creating places where water can flow rather than remaining in one area causing flooding. Urban systems can collect rainwater and repurpose it into gardens for watering lawns. Increasing the planting of trees, even in urban areas, can reduce runoff as well. So what's happening is where these roads didn't used to be, they are now, right? And so water is not able to evaporate from the ground anymore, right? Because it's trapped underneath this road. Yes? Okay, good. Water is no longer able to evaporate from underneath this building. So it's not getting back into the water cycle. And also, now that rain is falling, it's not going into the road. It has to find somewhere else to go. Does that make sense? Yeah. So a lot of cities, what they do is they'll build this storm drain. Unfortunately, with the storm drain, a lot of them are just putting it directly into your waterways. Why is that a bad thing?
It collects dirt and all the musty, nasty stuff in the city, in the water.
Yeah, it collects all the grossness from your city, right? So if littering happens, you're getting your water bottles, your trash, things like that. And think about drugs, right? So if you have an issue with drugs in your town and needles and things like that, where are those people living a lot of times? In the streets, right? Okay, especially in bigger cities. You go to Denver, and like every other block, you're seeing a homeless camp, right? And so that stuff's being washed into your drain, and so it's causing runoff of all these extra chemicals and things like that we don't necessarily want in our waterways, which are trying to give us water, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so the ways that you could prevent that, instead of building your building wider and taking a more surface area on the land, build it taller, right? Okay, you can fit the same amount of people in a taller building. You just build it taller, and you're taking up less of a footprint. Okay, on buildings that may not be used, tear them down, right? Nobody wants to tear down old buildings, but you should. There's interesting ologies podcasts about that in Detroit and how that's eating up a lot of things, right? And would there be the necessarily need to urban sprawl if you just repurpose buildings? Probably not, right? And then finally, plant trees. Plant some stuff. You know, plants love water, right? So you're planting stuff, it's going to absorb a lot of that water and reduce runoff. Okay? Questions about that? Comments, concerns? All right, so that's your module 30 notes in this recording real quick.